So welcome to the AA Writing Prize of 2002. We're delighted with all the shortlisted students. Really, really wonderful essays. I just wanted to give a very quick summary of how the day will work and then introduce our wonderful panelists. So what we'll do is we'll ask each student to do a 5-minute presentation. We'll see 3 students back to back, and then we'll open for discussion. Anybody online who'd like to join the discussion, please do raise a hand and we'll get it over to you. With that said, I'd like to introduce the panel. So I might just pass the mic around because that might be the easiest way of doing it. So over to Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick Simchikadeze, assistant professor of urban studies in Cambridge. I did diploma here a long time ago, and I'm excited to see what you guys do.
Hello, Claire Potter. I run the Writing Centre and teach in history and theory. I'm a writer. This is my favourite thing in the social calendar at the AA. I love it. I'm very happy to be here.
Nice. Hi, I'm Álvaro Velasco. I work with Claire in the Writing Centre. I teach history and theory in diploma, and then I teach foundation studio as well. So looking forward to hear you.
Hi, I'm Jeff. I'm a train driver on the Bakerloo line.
Hi, my name is Naima Kridge. I teach at History and Theory Studies in second year diploma and thesis, and I also teach in DRL. And I'm, like Claire, I'm very excited and happy to be here.
Thank you. Likewise. I'm Teresa Stoppani. I teach history and theory in diploma courses and thesis, and in the landscape urbanism program.
Thank you. Have I missed anybody online? Joaquim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Fair enough. I'm Joaquim Moreno, and I teach HTS at the diploma level, and I'm calling from Porto, my other job in the Atlantic. And I mean, really looking forward to hear. Yes, there's a well-known quality that our students can string together a couple of words that make a lot of sense. So let's hear it.
Wonderful. So with that, I'm going to invite the first 3 shortlisted students up to the table. So the first years, come on over.
So, 2.7 million Americans are treated for falls in the household each year. 1,076,558 average fall-related staircase accident. 12,000 deaths each year from falling down the stairs. 120,000 deaths due to domestic accident. And for the over 65s, fatal injuries in the home are more than 80%. So, the home is the most dangerous place to spend time in. This is a dramatic statement that should make all of us architecture students feel crisis. The house is a deadly trap that we pay gold for and spend hours cleaning it and taking care of it. But how can we not realize it? It is there for all of us to see. How can we still design a staircase when we know exactly that as soon as we become elderly, we'll no longer be able to use it? How can we continue to believe and love unconditionally something so senseless and dramatic? How can we justify the death of the soil and land in the name of a pretty house, of a pretty school, when cosmic inefficiency prevails within it? I'm convinced that we can do it, and we are legitimized to do it, because architecture has become a religion in every aspect, or a mythical science, if you want to say. I tried to describe in the essay the strong analogy between architects and the divinities of architecture, who shape space with their creative hands and their artistic flair, and the belief in a God capable of modeling man from clay. The architect pretends every day to play the role of the creator God, yet his failure is more than tangible. Difficult life in these days for the gods, though. If the Western God has been unmasked and his death announced by the madman in Nietzsche's gay science, then what boorish end can the architect come to? Will his utter failure be enough to question him, to find an alternative? Okay, the premises have been made, and I apologize for the dramatic initial images. But what have the worms got to do with all of this? And why is the Forte Quezzi residential complex a declaration of war on architects' divinities? So, the square was packed with people from all over the city, and the region who, disgusted and outraged at the sight of such a beast, begin shouting, "Criminal, horror, monster," and pointing their index finger at him. This is how a high school teacher explained to me the public trial for heresy of Joan of Arc and the subsequent sentencing to burning at the stake on 30 May 1431. In the same way, the trial of Galileo in 1633 and the trial of Savonarola in 1497 were explained to me. Same trial, same or similar sentences. Well, 500 years later, not a different fate awaited Forte Quezzi, which became the worm, Biscione, that is still associated with it today. Another public trial in which foolish crowds and acclaimed international critics associated the structure in a denigrating way with a worm, Biscione in Italian. In the essay I've taught, can this mere visual association, an analogy, if we want to use a term from literature, become a metaphor for a new architecture, a worm architecture? Well, the worm is the ultimate exaltation of the blind efficiency of nature. Scientific progress has shown us that the worm and the whole animal-vegetal world was not created by a divine end, but is the consequence of a slow process of evolution and adaptation. In fact, the worm plays its role the best it can, filling the earth, producing amino acids, etc. But if in the future the needs it is called upon to satisfy change, its appearance will also change, it will evolve. This is perfect natural functionalism, the result of a result that the divinity of architecture has never, or almost never, managed to achieve. No creative hand has conceived such a complex organism, the worm. And the same things happen in part, of course, with Forte Quezzi in Genoa. The form of the building, in fact, is born and develops with minimal prevarication over nature. This is thanks to the almost complete alienation of the architect's formalist claim on a form that already exists in essence. In fact, it is the morphological curves of the land that give shape to the building. If we could take this concept to extremes and demythologize architecture as well, we would arrive at a moment in which the creation of a building would develop like a growth of a flower, where it is the parameter and constraints of the context that generates and influence the form. Clearly, it will be a different outcome for each structure, but a perfect one to meet the needs it is called upon to satisfy. So worms are perhaps the way out of this vortex of inefficiency and cultural insensitivity. Worm architecture can therefore become a declaration of war against a profession that I think should be radically reconsidered, because the danger it is creating is too great. Thank you for the attention.
Okay, the border is threshold. Often I find myself gazing in the carpet and at my home in Tehran, and I specialize the image I see. And nevertheless, I don't think that exists anywhere, and it's in an elsewhere non-place. And I drew the pictures at some point, and it brought the question to me that what is it about this carpet that is spatial and is making it spatial? And I recognize that every day I move on a carpet freely, and I pass through various borders. I'm not limited, it's not blocking me, but nevertheless I do feel a different change in the surface. I do feel the change in the condition. So is it the border, the threshold? Is it only the carpet, or all the threshold? The borders could be seen as a threshold. And what is a carpet? So for the essay, it's basically a discussion on the analysis that depart from the examination by Keher's illustration on paradise, and moves to investigation on the first carpet ever found and the Persian carpet. So to respond my initial questions, as I said in the beginning, I had a very bold, important question in the beginning, and a diagram of how I would contextualize this question through putting it into spatial contexts and getting it and challenging it to a point that I'm able to say, what is it? Is it a border or a threshold? And by the way, you're going to hear these words a lot. So To begin with definitions, I would say that I try to stick with the terminology, with etymologies, to take everything from the very roots, and get to the point that borders seem to mean to be delineated, something demarcated, whereas the threshold was simultaneously something between two conditions. I took the paradise to be as one of the first roots of the word, as meaning within its etymology, as you can see, as a walled space that frames its origin of the border in the scope of language as a spatial and sacred concept as the first time in human understanding. So for the spatial examination, I looked at Kihers and thought that, okay, the wall allows two conditions to exist together and coexist. And it allows the sacred space and an exclusive, it allows for the sacred space to exist exclusively, and the earth exists on the outside. And whereas there is an in-between space, and the river passes from them. Moreover, I realized that there is this unmappable, ungraspable, non-place idea about paradise at the same time, which opens up the possibility to enter into the garden of the mind. And what do I mean by that? It is within the space that the boundary is removed by memory, which, without defying it, builds bridges between past and future. After 2 millennia, the memory of imagined paradise shares some sort of nostalgia of an innocent experience at the beginning of the history. And that is what I mean by allowing you to enter the garden of your mind and imagine again. But this could come and be extended to Persian carpet, an artifact that was first created in 550 BC. And the attempt of this carpet is to reproduce the spatial conditions of paradise, especially within daily life, which actually allows to understand that carpet is neither a space nor an object. It's something in between. Which brings me to the argument by Heidegger that a boundary is not that which something stops, but it in the Greek recognized a boundary is that from which something begins its presencing. So I think that the image of borders around the carpet, woven around the carpet, are basically the boundaries that allow rectangular delineation and constant transition between boundaries in order to bring a person from a sacred ground to a secular plane, or vice versa, and allow that rituals happen on the spot. But at the same time, you see that the image of the image of any carpet from the top has multiple boundaries, and it's filled with. Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. Has multiple boundaries, and you're able to move from one boundary to the other one. And this is the first illustration, the first carpet ever found. That at the time it was about an eternal hunting ground. The carpet captures the movement of hunters passing through multiple borders to reach the in-between to arrive where there are both plants and animals. So I just say that carpet's intermediary essence allows to redefine the role of visual borders and woven around the carpet as a threshold to alternate the interpretation of its inner space into reimagining a memory and past the visual borders to enter into the garden of the mind. Therefore, the threshold can be defined through a constant exchange of boundaries, a space surrounded by heterogeneities that agree to coexist in the edges of all their differences, hence redefining the role of the border within that physical and both mental space. And I'd like to say that even though the essay redefines entirely the notion within the notion of border within various architectural contexts, it implies in today's world and we cannot deny that, boundaries exist within social, political, or geographical aspects and spaces. Borders, rather than being merely peripheries or margins, are places in which power is concentrated and reproduced. The use and engagement with the notion of what is a border, what can it be defined as, is highly associated for knowing how to work with that. Because is it seen as a division and a conflict, or a critical moment to change behavior and mediate between all those discussions? Thank you.
So, good morning. In my essay, I was talking about the complex Karl Marx Hof in Red Vienna and its function of a fortification. But today I want to talk about more where my essay was started and what made me interested in writing about this building. So it came from my own experience of living in a social house. So I was raised in a very not well-known city in Russia. And till the age of 15, I was living in this very gray panel houses. Very common type of residential architecture in my city and in Russia in general. Most of these houses were built during 1950s, 1970s, when they needed to provide as much spaces for people to live in and spend as less budget. So it's very similar complex concept to the Red Vienna housing program. And it worked quite well. I mean, it wasn't a great architecture at all, but it provided space for people to live in, so they don't have to share one flat between several families anymore. And this experience of living in this house is not a thing that every one of you can have, and it really shapes your mind differently. And living in these houses, like barely anything changed till now. Most of these houses stayed the same till today, and most of the city center stayed the same. And if you go around the city, you barely know where you are because it's all looking exactly the same. And so my house was located on the Lenin Street, which is not a very unusual thing. It's a very common name for the street name. However, the next street to it was called Karl Marx. So maybe you're wondering what the German philosopher has to do with a Russian city, and why are we giving his name buildings and street names? And so this happened because it was a main figure for the. Oops, sorry. Is it not? This happened because it was the main figure of the Soviet government and his idea of bringing everyone together, the idea of unity, and the idea of everyone sharing the same thing and everyone having the same. So you work exactly the same and you bring back exactly the same. His idea was that private property is the source of conflict. So in his world, there is no private property. So there is no need to fight. So ideal world. We don't have to fight, we share everything, everyone have exactly the same thing. Utopian, but look at those people. They look happy, they look patriotic. And socialism was so deep in their hearts and minds, it almost became as a new religion for them. But look at them again, they're a mass. They look exactly the same. There is no chance to express yourself. As Karl Marx was suggesting, materialism was on the first place, and then spiritual and artistic matters. So how could you express yourselves? And then going back to Karl Marx Hof, how similar is the concept? It's exactly the same concept, but how different are those buildings? And how different is the architecture? How exactly the same movement could be expressed through complete different architecture? And looking at today, how it ended up differently. So it brings back the point how powerful architecture could be and how it's shaping us without us realizing it. So my question is, what architecture were you shaped by? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just say a quick thing. Every year when the writing prize starts up, I always think, I wonder if it's going to hit the same kind of level of discourse that it did the year before. And I have to say, I think one of the things which you can already see, even though you're first-year students, you're only beginning your journey through architectural education. It's so wonderful to see the fact that you're already identifying the written word as a way of formulating thought, first and foremost, above anything else. What I see in each of the 3 pieces is essentially a design project, one that might begin on paper. It might at one point move off from word into line, but somehow I think its root in word is perhaps always going to be there, and perhaps might always go back there. So thank you very much. I don't want to say too much. I just want to pass on to our panelists. You do need to speak into the mic for the audience.
Thanks, guys. So a couple questions. Such an interesting range, and I love how you're kind of thinking and very imaginatively, right? Kind of constructing your own arguments, sort of unshackled by some of the canon, I guess. So Riccardo, isn't Biscione a snake?
Yeah, actually, sorry. Yeah, Biscione, there are 2 names that were associated to their architecture. Also, Bruno Zemi was mentioning the fact of it was like a vermicone, which is more associated to a worm. But Biscione, yeah, Biscione in its essence is a snake, but it's still a derogatory association that has been done to this architecture. Yeah, there are 2 names, vermicone and then Biscione. Yeah.
Because Biscione, as a metaphor, has all kinds of other implications, like evil, is kind of more kind of vulgar implications as well. So I just wonder what that does to your argument, if it shifts it. I mean, I think that the fact that you've decided on worm, but maybe in Genova, Biscione is worm. I don't know. In Milano, it's definitely snake, but just wondering. But I think what's exciting about what you're saying is that there's 2 things that you touch on, but maybe with more time, and again, as a first year, it's very impressive that you got there, but maybe in the future you'd get to. One is, I mean, the idea of a kind of medieval modernism, so this idea of following the topography of the hill and not just cutting through it is very important in Italy, in Italian modernism, I think. So just reflect on that. The second is to reflect on the kind of popular desire to label buildings and what that does and what that means, right? There's a whole tradition of taxi drivers labeling things, you know, il palazzaccio, la macchina da scrivere, whatever.
Right.
So, and I think that there's a lot of power in that kind of democratic labeling of buildings, and I think you're touching on that. Mahshad, quick question. Can I just go around? Is that? I don't want to hog it, but just super quick. I love what you're doing. You raise the kind of endless philosophical question: is a border a threshold, or is it not? The word liminal comes from limes, which means border, right? The frontier of the Roman Empire, and liminal means threshold. I think it's a really important question, and I'm excited. I'm happy that you're excited by it. I think what you're kind of getting to, but maybe not quite getting to, but are really, really cleverly approaching is the spatiality of a surface, the fact that the ground can be a border and a threshold. But I think also there's the kind of iconography and language of the carpet, which raises the question of, is language a border or a threshold? Or is it both, right? So translation is a kind of threshold. And when you're doing kind of semiotic stuff, you're kind of getting into that a little bit, but you don't even realize it yet, maybe. So it's really, really, I think, imaginative, and you're kind of ahead of where you maybe realize you are. That's my thought. And then, Eseniya, very valiant effort to explain communism and Karl Marx. I mean, really kind of not an easy task to do as a first-year student. But looking at the essay, because there's a kind of, I mean, for you, I think the main tension that I found interesting in the essay was you were kind of grappling with the difference between a fortress and a community, right? And that dichotomy, Schloss versus Burg. And I think that's an important duality that's worth kind of protecting and thinking about some more. So that was, I think, one of the most enlightening bits of your essay.
Thank you so much. It was a really impressive range of and very diverse, very different topics. I would like to ask you, it struck me that they were left quite especially in the first two, quite open-ended and quite kind of abstract, you may say, especially the carpet one. And I would like to ask you to, if possible, to kind of expand on what could be defined as concluding kind of remarks in your essay, and perhaps if you had more time, what would you address? Where would you take the research and the argument next?
I'm not sure I understood the first part of your question, not the rest. Well, did I take it?
It felt quite abstract, quite.
Yes.
So I don't know if you could, perhaps the most abstract of the three.
Okay.
And if you could maybe pinpoint more specific, and there are, say, more architectural, perhaps
Aspect of it?
example,
Sure.
or yeah.
Okay, thank you. I guess the entire question is that paradise and Persian carpets are basically different representations of a concept, both of them. And this is how I've been developing it. And carpet seems to be the most interactive possibility of bringing a paradise into your house, into your daily life, into your rituals, and that you perform with it, you walk on it, you live with it, you think through it. And maybe it's not, I'm being very dramatic here, but really sometimes it affects the way you, for example, only eat on a carpet. And it brings that idea of comfortability that does not exist in the earth, but exists in the carpet, exists in the paradise, or the that different, the two conditions outside the carpet and inside the carpet. I think that was the two conditions I was trying to bold, but then it was also about how carpets borders can be seen in three different bullet points. One is that itself as a geometry and the way it is allocated in a house delineates a space. Secondly, the visual borders themselves, and that's where it becomes abstract, the visual borders on the carpet enter you to an image, and an image from the top bird eye viewpoint, which you might not understand in the first glance, but you have to think about it. And that's where it takes you to the garden of your mind, because not every one of us will imagine or will understand that space and that visualization the same. And since it is a representation of paradise historically, and that's where I didn't say it right, where I was talking about the hunters going to it's the representation, constant representation of paradise within a carpet. And that's where I wanted to connect. You go inside something, you pass through that visual border that I wasn't really sure at the beginning what it was for, which doesn't make it a border anymore, it's a threshold. And then the reason I looked at it within paradise is that it becomes walls and it has a height. And it's more physical, it's more related to architecture. And I could play around with that more. It was, yeah. Sorry for...
What would you do if you had kind of more time to expand on your essay?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a starting point, and it's I wouldn't say critics, but because even the word critics comes from Greek and means to judge. And what I wanted to try here, and also to assume my position in this period at the AA, is to judge like some facts and realities, and try to understand the reason that is behind it, and what can be done to change even in a small part, or make more awareness to some problematics that I feel that really exist and are really problematic, as I said. So in terms also of architecture and what could be an output of this speculation is definitely I think I'm really fascinated. I was saying also in the Esin speech that the natural cycle of nature and how everything happens for a reason, but this reason is for self-sustaining the natural cycle itself. So there is no there is no art in nature. I mean, nature is beautiful, it's amazing, but this beauty comes from a perfect functionalism that works around the needs of satisfying certain needs. So the question is, yeah, absolutely, how to apply that into architecture, because that's what we are studying here and what I want to do in my future. So it's an open-ended question, absolutely, yeah.
And about your essay, how would you expand it, and perhaps even given the kind of current situation, the horrific conflict that's happened?
Because my starting point was, in my essay, my conclusion was that Karl Marx Hof is a castle for the working class. And as I was saying, it's the same. Actually the socialism in Austria. It happened much earlier than in my country. Then why were the different outcomes of this movement? And it's a huge topic to discuss, the connection of the politics, the psychology, and architecture. And I think it's just like so much more to think. And what did it happen because of the mentality? Did it happen just because of the space for people? And yeah, it's an endless field to just think about it and to talk and explore more and more. But yeah.
Yeah, it's extremely rich, and just to say that one of the diploma tutors has actually written a book about this house in Gabel Hindel, so definitely look into that.
Okay, I just wanted to continue with something that Masha said that I thought very beautiful, and that I think connects the three of you. You're all object-based essays, so each of you, you're focusing into one specific thing. In your case, I think it's a very live experience of the object, like you have interacted with it. And that becomes apparent in the essay, so when you write. Perhaps not that much in the presentation. You were very architect's kind point of view. You were showing us carpets as if they were plants. And I think that value of having engaged with your whole body with the object is something really valuable when we are dealing with an essay. I don't know if you have further thoughts on that, but I wanted to ask you, both of you, what has been your relationship with the building, that you were both looking at the building? And I really like your presentation, and you were saying, I don't know if you've been to Karl Marx Hof, but you started because you lived in something that was like that. So when we look at history of architecture, many times we think in journals, photographs, archives, and I'm very interested in seeing what you think about this kind of lived experience and the writing of it.
Yeah, when I said I lived in this kind of the same social housing, but it was a complete different. That was I was interested. It's the same concept, the same kind of idea of unity of people and the working class, but complete different experience. I mean, I haven't been to Karl Marx Hof, but from what I've seen, the pictures and the plans of the buildings, it's a complete different architectural space. Because, and I was saying that Karl Marx Hof is a very unique symbol of Red Vienna, but when you look at the socialism in my country, all the buildings are exactly the same. If you go to one city in the center and then on the other end of the country, also in the area where it was built in the 50s, 60s, you will not understand where are you. Like you will be lost in a space, you will be lost in time. So that's the thing that it's not changing, which I'm really worried about.
Not the building in particular, but I've always been fascinated about the Una Casa plan, the Piano Una Casa, which this building is part of, because in the post-war in Italy, the state, the government and the parliament decided to activate this plan to basically rebuild and reshape the face of Italy, because in 20 years period they built homes for 300,000 people and 40,000 workers worked along every year. So it's a very strong action from the government, and this reshaped the face of Italy, because if we go to every capital cities in Italy, we see that many of these houses, of these housing blocks, comes from this Una Casa plan. And the Biscione, the Vermicone in Genoa, is also part of this. And so the thing is that I was trying to explain in the essay that there has been some guidelines that were basically guiding the architects in the direction of kind of shutting down the innovative drive, going towards a more economical response, because at first it was an economical response from the government to give work to people. And so the innovation architecture and the construction techniques wasn't really the central point, the core point. In the Biscione, in the Forte Quets in Genoa, I was fascinated about first of all, the actual public trial that associated this building to in a derogatory way to this animal. And then also the architectural choice of, because if we see the whole development of the piano in a casa, we see that housing blocks looks almost similar every time. And in the Biscione, the architect didn't decide for the shape. So there is a sort of alienation of his role, because the role of the architect is with his, I mean, that's what I'm learning, but like with his hands to shape the soil, trying to give an answer to the needs of people. But here in this case, it was the morphological lines, and so I was fascinated about these aspects, basically. But I've never been there yet. I would love to go.
A general thing, I guess. You have all decided to present something other than your text. So we've read your texts, and then the presentation becomes something else. I don't know whether you were taking for granted that we've read the text. We have, but there's also an audience. So maybe I would like to invite you to tell us a bit more, not only about the text, but what does it mean to write a short essay in architecture, not necessarily about architecture, because then we need to decide what architecture is, but also how you have designed the essay itself. Given that, yes, you do have, let's say, a main object or a parent object of interest, which actually becomes almost an excuse or a site to construct an argument. And that's where the differences are, not so much in the scale or the label of your object of interest, but where do you stop? Is it an analysis? Is an analysis which applies a specific method, whether it's etymology or political analysis or whatever? Where do you stop, and what do you want to give to yourself and to your readers? In other words, what is this text, if this text is a project? I know it's a difficult question, because it's a difficult question for an architect. What is a project, and where do we stop the project? So you don't have to answer, but I would like to know a bit more about how you decided to structure your text and where you decided to stop, not because of the length required, but in terms of what you wanted to say.
No, that's definitely a very interesting question, and it was, first of all, an opportunity, I think, writing this essay. But it's important to say that we had some constraints. The constraint was define a case of interest, a case of study that was mentioned or could be related to Pier Vittorio Aureli lectures, and around that develop some points. So there are still, I mean, personally, in my case, I try. Maybe I could change the format, but in this essay, I try to separate and go from an more analytical explanation of what the piano in a casa is, and some facts about the Forte Quets in Genoa, and then taking this as ingredients, developing a more argumentative way of expressing. So it was not a extremely free format essay, but still having these two ways of explaining running in parallel, because you have to develop one and another and put them together in order that they coexist in a fluid and organic way. There was an opportunity, but And then in general, yeah, approaching to an HTS essay with almost complete freedom, because I think now that we're students, we have this freedom. Probably in our future, when we're gonna go into the practice world, if we want to, probably the freedom will not be there anymore. But so yeah, I think there was an opportunity. And
for me, it was an experience of writing this essay, and I tried to combine different kind of story life when I started my essay, and I was talking about a story where people protected this building and how they united and raised against fascism, and the building became a fortress to them. This was my starting point. And I started to go deeper into the etymology and then at the construction and the architectural elements. And this is whole kind of getting some facts, some stories, some research, analyzing it, and then adding it up to a statement. And then you kind of have, because it's this, my conclusion, it's a small conclusion of a bigger thing, because it's just the beginning. It's a quite small essay to talk about such a huge topic and connecting it to everything else. It can be endless. So I think, but this first step was just kind of getting everything together, making your own statement, making your own, what do you think about this building, asking myself, what do I think, what is it? Is it a social housing? Well, maybe not. And this kind of conversation with a reader as well, I think. This was.
It was, first of all, a super confusing process for a very long time. I was very confused, and I at some point I just wanted to just submit my essay, whatever it was. But I remember, usually I'm very, very interested in human mind and the space I'm no one to say this, but necessarily, but the understanding of space is something very abstract, I think, and it also happens within a very individual process and has its own philosophies with your mind. And I'm fascinated with that, with body and mind in general. I've always been. When I started the architecture course, I was like, well, we live in spaces we use structural elements in to just define what we're living in. I want to know those connections more. I want to see my personal experience, my movements, my body, my thoughts, and how they're being represented within a space. How are all those concepts and those thoughts within all the human generation and historical facts has been come to now and are represented in this space? I'm daily interacting with it. I'm thinking in it. I'm not sure. I'm confused, and I like to know more. And I always have all these thoughts in like basic notation of my own personal thoughts, and it brings up different questions. And I wasn't really joking or like lying about. Really, I was seeing a carpet at a house and trying to draw it and draw what I'm seeing. So really, for this essay, I wrote a lot of observation of my own, lots of personal experiences. I regret I didn't show them enough. I do. But to a point that I could bring up other people's arguments and support my own thoughts, see if they're even accurate, see if they're worth like working around, and knowing more about the concept of the space and threshold and border. I remember one of my very important the citation is Fundamentals of Architecture. In there, I was looking at space and threshold. That was for me something new, and something I didn't use at the HTS courses. Yeah.
I wonder if I might just quickly throw something out there in a kind of I'm going to very heavily project on you guys for a moment. I'm thinking about your opening statement. You know, if God is dead, like what chance does the architect have? Great. And then obviously there's the references to paradise, In your case, you said, why is this what happened? Why is this how Karl Marx gets translated in Russia / the Soviet Union versus in Austria? So just a quick aside, I strongly recommend that you read Dostoevsky's brothers Karamazov. Have you read it? Okay, because I think that goes a long way in describing precisely why it happens, right, in the form of those three brothers. But I'm reminded of a text I recently read about which animals were brought onto the ark, onto Noah's Ark. And apparently the animals that were not brought on were animals that at the time were, so particularly in medieval literature, they were understood as being self-generative. So things like fleas, worms, because they basically come out of decay, the understanding at the time was that they self-generate themselves, so you don't have to bring them on, you don't have to protect them. And then I'm thinking back to what Nick was saying when he said the worm versus the snake. And I don't know if it's because, I don't know where I'm picking up this like hyper-religious narrative, but I'm just gonna go with it. You know, if we think of then the difference that the snake plays in like religious narrative versus the worm, I guess, and this is what I mean about clearly I'm projecting pretty heavily on each of you, but I wonder, I'm not particularly bothered actually that it might not necessarily be architecture at the moment, you know, with a capital A. It seems to me that actually what you are talking about is much more nuanced about the way we conceive of ourselves in space and the kind of structures that the social and cultural structures that we build to enable us to feel at home within the border / threshold of X, Y, or Z. So I suppose the one, it's not a question, sorry, it's just a statement. I suppose the one thing I would maybe ask of each of you is what is the kind of absurd conclusion that you might come to based on what you've written? And what are the kind of accidents that may have happened which might take you somewhere unexpected? Do you need to maybe go back and think of this space if it were a snake versus if it were a worm? How would Nietzsche respond to them? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think there's a kind of playful, and I thought it was very funny in your case that we're looking at Brezhnev, which is a very interesting point in Soviet history. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not Stalin, it's not Lenin, it's not even Khrushchev, it's Brezhnev. You know, like he's like on the edge of the end. So I suppose, I think maybe coming back to what Teresa said, there was a kind of reformulation of your pieces today, which is wonderful, and maybe actually looking at the accident of what has happened there and imagining what's the most absurd conclusion I could come to, because maybe that gives me a journey for 5 years. So.
I'm happy to. Was that a question? Was that a question?
It wasn't a question. I was just putting it out there.
Did you want to respond?
You'll respond if you want to. I don't know if it was a question.
Just to go on a slight tilt to that,
Please
I would argue that one could argue, and I would argue that writing itself is an architectural act.
Yes.
So I would, for me, to put your thought, to take the artifact, for example, to turn it into the essay, is an architectural act in itself. Thinking about particularly about Mahshad's project of this kind of, which I find so fascinating in relation to carpets, it is this three-dimensional object, but it's not. It's a two-dimensional object. As a non-architect, I step into it. I feel its depth, but it's flat. I look at a plan. I'm supposed to understand its depth, but it's flat. I find that spatially extremely complicated to understand. The essay has the same kind of thing. A piece of writing has the same kind of thing, effect. Putting it on the page, it creates a depth into this flat object. So I think, for me, all of you, there's this kind of rebellious thread that's running through all of the work that I absolutely love, that is using writing, using particularly essay writing, to create and explore the artifact. Riccardo, you're pushing together poetry, manifesto, philosophy, social housing, politics. You begin with a manifesto poem. You begin with a historical analysis of the picture, of the artifact and the picture. then you take this kind of philosophical turn, poetic philosophical turn, into actually turning around what Nick was saying about, the trial of the building of the insult into it being actually a mechanism for thinking about it differently. Such a pleasure and a joy in the writing that one feels, which I felt across all of the writing. As a reader, one enjoys immensely. So that kind of, these different forms put together, the poetic, the manifesto, the analytical, historical, and this kind of metaphorical at the end, was extremely, I thought, structurally fascinating. Eseniya, that kind of this drive, the narrative drive in your piece, which not strangely was part of your presentation, was such a strength in your writing, I thought. Beginning with a picture, painting a picture at the beginning of a social happening that embodies what the essay then uses as a catalyst to understand fortification, protection, relationship of the train line, of movement of people into a place to look after themselves. I thought was just an absolute strength of the writing, and that's something that you brought really ahead in your writings. This kind of narrativization of architectural experience through politics, I thought was just, to me that is an architectural act. Mahshad, I thought the same. There was something about this, the kind of porosity and strong, you were all doing the etymological aspect, but this strong, almost like dodge cards, hitting words against other words, seeing what, it doesn't matter whether they perfectly fit, but just like hitting things against each other etymologically and seeing where they go. I thought that was absolutely fantastic. And this kind of porosity in the writing itself that just meanders and wanders in the true sense of an essay, showing a mind at work that has a line of thought that traces through, I thought was extremely good. There was one thought that I had while I was reading it. I don't know whether you did it on purpose, but one of your key words, which was threshold, was one of the words that you resisted analysing etymologically. And I wondered whether that was done on purpose, but thinking about the word threshold architecturally, and thinking about what Alvaro was saying about the body and the feet, the threshold comes from the idea of threshing. So, you have the oxen and the feet turning around the space, which is, what do you call it? What's the word? Grounding grain. So this kind of, so this community activity of grinding in the circular space. Then on the outer layer of the community standing around and watching and telling stories and talking about it. So this kind of space that then gives way to the Greek amphitheatre and performivity and theatrical experience. Taking your feet off to go onto the carpet, taking your feet off to grind the grain. And so this kind of physical aspect of performance, amphitheatre, stepping onto the carpet, stepping off the carpet. I thought that was something that perhaps that etymologically that word might give you an extra dimension of movement to bring the body into it as well.
Thank you.
I really like all the essays. I guess if God is dead, there are no absolutes, and it's really nice that you kind of take the word and you smash it from the bottom and reinterpret it up. I think that was really great, and all the essays just seem like a rumination of a single word, and then you synthesize it with, I guess, your own personal interests and redefining the word. It's really interesting, and I guess I'll never look at a carpet the same way again. And when I'm looking at the carpet, I feel like then I kind of transcend that carpet into the city and then the built environment. And every time I'm passing something now, I'm always thinking about thresholds and borders. And I feel like it'd be really interesting to see your work, because I think that would probably come through, because I guess words are really important. And because you're exploring this word, you'll probably see it in the language of your architecture, which I think is be really cool. And I guess the same with the fortification one as well. I guess I like the whole narrative thing. I guess people don't like saying postmodern anymore, but yeah, it's very postmodern to kind of do that. And splicing in, yeah, history and then linking it with the word. Yeah, God is dead, no absolutes, so then evolution, I guess, isn't it? I think that's it. Yeah, and I guess, is the city a paradise then, I guess, with the whole borders and thresholds thing. And I really like the image. It just kind of made me think about maybe the city is meant to be paradise, and that's what we're making. And yeah, we're living in paradise, right now, because we're making it. Yeah, I think that's it. So.
Yeah.
Your time. Super.
We should wrap up very soon.
Okay, well, super quick. I mean, I'm just reflecting on all the comments as well. As you embark on this journey of designing and writing and designing, you've all started with space and then sought to kind of uncode that space or give us a story about that space. But there's a separate story that could be told about all your projects, which starts with people and then gets to space. So let's not forget that, right? So for yours, it's the popular narratives around buildings and what that means and what that does to people's inhabitations of space. For yours, it's how people shape their lives within different forms of social housing and then what that says about the building itself. And for yours, it's the anthropology of the threshold. So when we look at that tradition, the threshold is not about a space necessarily, but about a ritual process. It's like a bar mitzvah or a wedding, right, or kind of thing. And so then that has a spatial dimension, but if we start from the point of view of process, then how do we approach the carpet, right? We're starting from walking in and out. Just go back. Yeah. So just remember that you can start from somewhere else and get to space. You don't have to start from space. Right? Yes,
Amazing. I'm going to pass. Oh, where are you, Joaquin? Yes. Yep. Amazing.
Well, okay.
So sorry. You know what? With second years, you're going to go first because you're kind of behind me, and okay. I'm so sorry to forget you. But please.
No. It's okay. It's okay. I'll play the audience for a second.
Okay.
Because I hadn't read the essays, and I was just making a very, very different plan. You know, when I was, of course, seeing the image of the Garden of Paradise, evidently, you know, the carpets tend to be images of the Garden of Eden, of a very close garden, you know, but carpets are famously portable images. So they are portable paradises. You know? What I was thinking, well, one is the very plain problem, no? Which is normally if you have a really, really beautiful carpet, you put it vertical. You don't put it horizontal, no? And it becomes an image and a landscape and an enclosure. And there is a whole set of problems regarding that particular enclosure. But that's one image that I actually prefer, which is a very bizarre type of Roman mosaic called the Azaraton, which is basically also an image, but it's an image of excess and decadence. It's normally the kind of mosaic where you see the remains of the banquet and even see little animals, rotten food. No? And that's another floor where definitely when you step onto that floor that depicts the unswept floor, that's why it's called the Azaraton, no? It depicts the tragedy of life. And it might work as a pair if you really want to deal with grounds and images of paradise. And of course, threshing. Also, we're talking about gardens, and some gardens produce food. And threshing is a very, very famous ritual to separate the husk from the grain. It's a collective ritual because it ensures collective survival. You know? And all these components, I think, that's why I was always thinking about the mosaic with the rotten food. I think it holds a very beautiful symbol to that. And to be on the other side, I'm always proposing very weird kind of things, I guess. For the other two essays, I would propose a conversation. I think it's a wonderful, you need to talk, people. No? Imagine that one is very good talking about neorealism, that I think it's what you want to talk about when you deal with Ina Casa. And someone else is talking about realism, which is more or less what happened. And why am I saying all this? We could go really in deep, in work, in image. No? I mean, a lot has been written, but there are two very strange, there is a beautiful, beautiful radio piece by the Kitchen Sisters called Dissident Kitchens, which is precisely about the introduction of the private kitchen inside the apartment that happened when, after Stalin's death, when Nikita Khrushchev arrived to power, it's the moment where the kitchen gets back home. You know? And they did an incredible little program. Even the son of Nikita Khrushchev speaks in the program, and they are called dissident kitchens. The very, very dangerous kitchens where people gather around the table. You know? That make them social in a very, very different way because society was organizing differently. That's an incredible, that really makes for a different narrative than simply the parallel. And of course, I would always look to the very apocalyptic end of famous Manfredo Tafuri essay on the Red Vienna, no? The castle, the workers' castle, hold up to the shelling, the fight, was the trust in the party that was broken forever. No? It was the betrayal of the political intent. No? Because Tafuri was always hated by saying that the Red Vienna was a retreat. The Red Vienna was an archipelago, no? Not a continuous presence. And that sees differently. But still, when I would go and move to one from the other, I would talk about work, because we are talking about prefabricated buildings. No? The Red Vienna had no ambition to reinvent the way we make buildings. No? The Red Vienna was rhetorics, not research. It was not the Siedlungen. The construction in the Soviet Union in the 50s, it had research and prefabrication. It was meant to produce a lot with less work, which is the exact opposite of Ina Casa. That's why one is realist and the other is neo-realist. Because Ina Casa was about making, not having idle hands. Idle hands do the devil's work. No? In Catholic countries, that always works. So basically, the whole point of most of Ina Casa was to use very, very basic technology, very labor-intensive technology. And that thing resulted in those very funky, some of those very funky looking traditional buildings, or in high rises done with very humble techniques. You know? And we came to call it neorealism because architecture was called to distribute work instead of saving it. It's a very strange polarity. I think it would be fun to stage sometimes a conversation. You know? And for the warm, just I'll finish very fast. I would heavily recommend being very literally, because the warm was actually fundamental as a form of perspective in the history of modern architecture. You know? The great Choisy understood that top view axonometrics didn't tell you much. So he invented the worm's eye view, which is the wonderful perspective that has plan, section, and interior elevation. So there must be some intelligence to the worm's eye view that might help. But yes, I would always go to very funky references and maybe found a way through dialogue and through conversation. Your first year students, find a good debate, no? Find a good agon, no? In the classical sense, and discover each other's argument. Listen, basically. That's what I'm trying to say. No? That's one of the very important ways of writing is listening. Thank you. Sorry, I always talk too much.
Thank you. Ooh, thank you so much. Thank you so much to our first years. And let's move on to second years, but first a round of applause. So if I could invite the second years up to the table, and may I just remind everybody to please help yourselves to the croissants and the coffee in the corner, which are here for you.
Hello. Oh, that's good. Okay. Hi, everyone. So my name is Charlotte, and my essay is called Learning Architecture is Child's Play. So what does that mean? Well, to answer why play has anything to do with architectural education, we have to know first what is play. So these are the 5 rules of play as set out by Huizinga in his book Homo Ludens. The participants of play must be free to join in or leave at any time. The play must happen outside of normal life, as in not at work or something like that. It has distinct times and spaces. It creates order, as in the participants make and follow their own rules. And the play must be engaged in without the motivation of reward or any such certificate or something like this. So Kalua, he further breaks down play into these 4 categories. That is Agon, which is games of skill, Alia, games of chance, and mimicry, which is role-playing, and Ilinx, which is creating a sort of temporary disruption of perception. For example, when a young child runs around in circles or shakes their head to make themselves feel dizzy. And play has been present in education since the invention of kindergarten in the mid-19th century. The pedagogue, Frederick Froebel, designed a set of gifts that he gave to children, and it taught them the natural laws of mathematics, physics, and geometry through a kind of synthesis that happens through guided play. So you can see here the ball spinning around. So you take this ball on a string and you whirl it around. So that sort of gives you an intuitive understanding of centrifuge. Or dropping the ball and hearing it hit the ground, that gives you a sort of understanding of gravity. It also, so this is another gift. So you spin these wooden blocks around. So you can see when you take a cylinder and you spin it around, you can see a sphere inside. So the child is learning about all of these parts and wholes, these relationships, these patterns. So what does architectural education look like without play? So here's a picture of a classroom at the École des Beaux-Arts. So you have people sitting in rows, the studio master at the front. It's a very vertical hierarchy. Everyone's sort of memorizing these Doric orders and these different things without a sort of intuitive understanding. And it sort of fosters this environment that doesn't really encourage play. And while there is a sort of game in the form of the design charrettes, a sort of skill that you compete against each other, it doesn't really follow all the rules of play. You sort of have to participate, and you also, it's really, really part of work, and you can also, it's motivated by reward. However, at the AA, there has always been a culture of play, one could argue. So this is a picture of one of the Christmas pantomimes that the AA has had since the inception of it as a members club, and obviously they don't have them anymore, but it was probably done in the name of good fun. But this kind of voluntary role-playing activity, this kind of mimicry, as well as the students making all of the set, the costumes, writing the music and everything else that goes along with that, it teaches the students an extremely important lesson, and it allows them to participate and imagine something that hasn't yet occurred and something not yet created. Looking at one of the playbills from 1956, you can see that the cast is actually not only just students, but also established alumni and possibly staff. And I believe that engaging in this pantomime altogether allowed for the hierarchy that is generally present in architectural institutions to disintegrate, allowing for further playful interactions. The Bauhaus contains another example of play in architectural education. However, this time it's incorporated directly into the curriculum. Unlike the pantomimes at the AA, Oskar Schlemmer and his students, triadic ballets, they call them, they are not mimicry, but more like illings. The students are guided by him to explore space with their bodies, creating these dances, these ballets. They dance with freedom in order to create something that is beautiful, and it's sort of out of nothing but pure movement itself. Suddenly, the static proportions of the human body as memorized by the students of the Beaux-Arts seems irrelevant. So, further breaking down formalities, Schlemmer often joined in with his students on these performances. And they performed them in front of the entire school. So you could say that the choreography of these ballets also moves the bodies of the people inside the building of the school. When play is present in architectural pedagogy, something magical occurs. Whether intentional or not, the illings of the triadic ballets and the pantomimes of the AA broke down the hierarchy of a traditional architecture school. These activities gave people the time and the space needed for the development and a deep understanding of the rules that govern both nature and culture. Play gives us the gift of intuition, imagination, and empathy. And without play, an architectural education is just fragmented pieces of knowledge, absent of any satisfying conclusion. Thank you.
So, hello everyone, I'm Sacha, an X12 student, and today I'll talk about my Term 2 essay, Grands Ensembles, Remnants of a Future and Architectural Potential. So, Grands Ensembles are a French term used to describe the social estate from the 60s and 70s, so first modern in the 60s, then postmodern in the 70s, that were built in the peripheries of the main big cities, and particularly in the capital. So to introduce these buildings, I used this series from a French photograph called Laurent Cronenthal. I haven't used this series in the essay, but I thought it was maybe the best work today to kind of introduce the aesthetic, this such fascinating aesthetic of these buildings, and how it kind of helped to show how aliens they are in the kind of the collective imagination we have of the French style way of living, with the analogy of the Haussmannian bourgeois flat in the capital, and you could already see some kind of looking at the scale of the person, this kind of how scales and the atmosphere in this building can kind of cause already some issues. And so the initial idea was to discuss whether or not those buildings should be demolished, because nowadays they are still a big part of the architectural but mainly political discourse in France because they are considered to be a failure. They have some insecurity issues, and very like precarious life conditions, and so there is a kind of the dominant speech is we should demolish them with the out of sight, out of mind way of thinking. And so I was trying in this essay not to defend this building or the modernist or postmodernist aesthetic, because architecture is not really. It matters less in the aesthetic than in ways it kind of modifies space and brings distinctions and uses in spaces. And so the idea was really just to, from an outside point of view, because I've never been in one of them and I've never lived in those buildings. However, as a Parisian native from Paris, I've been walking around quite a lot, looking at this strange aging concrete monoliths in the capital. And so was just with kind of trying to keep a position of humility. Is the demolition really a solution when it's about asking people to leave their housing? So the first part of the essay really with this kind of outside exterior vantage point, I tried to not establish like a writer-reader position within the essay, because I was really, as I was writing the text, I was learning at the same time and discovering these first like the method of production of those buildings, and then the first material and social degradation. And so I was trying also, because today mainly in the political discourse the idea is that it's not really a political or social failure, it's more of an architectural failure, and I was trying to understand this. And so first looking at the urbanism of those buildings, there was this idea that looking at the modern urbanism from the progressist urbanism in opposition with the more naturalist or culturalist urbanism, there was this idea to kind of reduce the number of axes of circulation, and the circulation in those constructions would become independent from the built volumes. And there was also a kind of separation of the circulation from the cars to the pedestrian, as you can see on this project in Strasbourg. And so already looking at this kind of progressist urbanism that defines the grands ensembles, there was some limits already by the beginning, very in the early criticism, that in a situation where all functions are optimized to the extreme and spatially distributed, it is doubtful whether there is any room left for the freedom and development of individuals. And this ideology of excessive efficiency appears then to be more of a constraint than any form of progress. And so that was mainly the case for the 60s, so the early grands ensembles. Then moving to the 70s, the modernist aesthetic turned into a more postmodern aesthetic, as this is the case with the Cité du Parc by Jean Renaudier in 1972, where you have some more deflections in the facade and some separation and distinctions on the public space with like the introduction of some terraces. Yeah, but even with this kind of aesthetic additional features, there was still this kind of problem that you can resume by seeking to think of everything in a single gesture. This absolute approach upset the scales and shifted the intention demanded by the interior living spaces to the urban master plan, and the propulsion of architectural issues to a national scale, state scale, and mass planning in their production condemned the grands ensembles to a distant view of the project, but more importantly, a distant view from the inhabitants. And so then, as a case study, I was looking at the Tour Bois le Prêtre, which is a very interesting case study because it kind of experienced all the different stages that could resume the history of the grands ensembles. First, the completion in the 60s, then a first attempt of rehabilitation in the 90s that was just the add of aesthetic panels on the facades, and then a real rehabilitation by Drew, like at Vasal, in 2014. And this case study kind of allows me to show that it is not really the architecture of the construction that causes the failure of it. It's more the lack of architecture, actually, and the fact that urbanism and architecture were made at the same time during the completion. And so this project with the rehabilitation conserve the advantages of the high-rise building and the vertical distribution, and have introduced an horizontal extension with balconies and loggias, thus offering each flat its own garden. They play a role as a membrane between public and individual space, and thus bring collective housing a little closer to the individual house. And so now I'm kind of using this notion in my unit project, where I try to create this kind of, on the waterways of London, create this membrane around the boats between the public and the private. And yeah, just as to finish, that was the small series that I introduced in the essay to kind of argue the aesthetic fascinating features of these buildings without defending the fact that we should just talk about keeping the modern aspect of it. Yeah, thank you.
I'll just say that the video footage is taken from a film called The Blue Box of Michal Weitz. The forest is formless, a place without space, geometry, or direction, civilization primeval and negation. Large plot of land covered with trees, when inside it's endless, difficult to get familiar and to orient in space. The forest body in Israel has a dual sense of naturality. Even when planted, its artificiality is concealed by the force of nature. Is it playing? Sorry. Make the Desert Bloom was the name of the Zionist premise to revive the proclaimed abandoned country. The false claim for a lifeless and bloomless land was necessary then to strengthen the claim for Jewish rootedness and to prevent from Palestinians the right to return. The forest then provided the ground on which multiple memories could be blended in the same territory. The Jewish National Fund has been one of the central institutions implementing the Zionist mission. The reclamation of the land as a collective property of the Jewish people was made not only in the name of the present, but also those living abroad. With donations from the diaspora, it purchased land in Palestine. After the establishment of the state in 1948, the most vivid undertakings of JNF tend to be tree planting. JNF forests are calm and pastoral. Stones of different sizes mark pathways, wooded picnic tables spread around. They're being visited mostly during daytime by families in holidays, military ceremonies, and school trips, all of which play a solid institutional role in one individual's life. Family, community, nation. The practice of these activities ties a bond of multiple emotional levels to the territory of the forest. As much as it is devastatingly painful to doubt these life assets separately, not having the forest, which blends them all together, becomes unthinked of. For it to not collapse, it stands high and deeply rooted, covering the already destroyed structures of Palestinian stone homes. By the repetition of the act of plantation, the forest rises. Erected still, the vastness of the forest stands for the extent of denial needed to lead this project. Again and again, when the tree is rooted, the irresistible cycle of vegetation, where death merely prompts a rebirth, seems to promise true national immortality. The abrupted course of life is being slowly swallowed in the forest, yes, yet the opposite takes place too. The same repetitiveness gives the forest an ability to reject that which is foreign. It rather accentuates the stone traces within it. Paradoxically, the trees also ended up protecting the walls from further destruction and assimilation into the new Israeliness. They surround and separate them from the transformation happening outside. The remains were therefore kept frozen in time within the forest. Satellite imagery allows seeing the afforestation project in zoom out. Receding, the erasure is successful. Dark green wooded land on a bare new terrain. From above, the forest is an emptiness where traces of life cannot be found. But they do exist. Documentation produced by former Palestinian villagers shows another layer of memory. The primary way in which the place that used to be a home is reconstructed is by powerfully ignoring the trees of JNF and holding on to the partial traces of the past, rubbles of stones, fig trees, and cacti mostly. The bodily experience brings the missing parts back to life. The familiar orientation is a proof for an unerasable presence, capable of rising structures back from the flattened plot. Memory and imagination are instruments able to resist the physical erasure. By this, the verbal, the formless, makes the absent present again. Perhaps, just as the forest erases memories, memories can erase the forest. The pine forest grew down in height. Long arching trees went back to saplings. Land was exposed again. Scattered rubble started rolling back from different corners of the plot. Raised again a wall. Then worker came to kneel and redig a tree to be then carefully placed on a track heading back to the tree nursery. By the time they got there, the saplings turned to seeds again. They were then collected by one attendant. It was his task, which he then went and completed, to put it somewhere, to hide it cleverly, so they would never hurt anyone again. Thank you.
So I've got no presentation, just words. Good morning, everyone. My essay, Domestic Role of Indian Women, A Tale of the Civilizing Intent of the British Empire, tries to fill the gap that I feel existed in writings about colonial domesticity in British India. It compares the role of women in Indian households in pre- and post-colonial homes. By using local perspectives, it tries to open conversation about visibility, capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism, and how they all link to each other. My methodology while writing this essay was influenced by my own quest for answers when it comes to this topic. The essay follows a very simple structure of first objectively comparing the pre- and colonial homes in terms of domesticity of the Indian woman, and then looks at reasons why this may be. It further goes down into reviewing and analyzing actual homes from the time to confirm my knowledge. The cultural aspect was motivated by my own experiences growing up in India. I have actively tried to notice the play of patriarchy in domestic environments, but when it comes to reading academic work, I saw an opportunity to express my own views in the current scenario, which I think is moving towards local South Asian voices. The essay discusses how the British not only imposed their patriarchal norms on the Indian society, but also motivated the Indian male to impose authority on the Indian woman. My work focuses not only on the British male, but also on the British female, who also played a pivotal role in normalizing colonization. It looks at how, by acting as transforming social benefactors, the British replaced the rich histories of Indian philosophies that were once associated with religion, education, and health by the colonial philosophy of conversion, modernizing, and improvement. While performing daily household activities in the open courtyard typology that existed in India, the Indian woman was heard and seen in her domesticity. The British colonial house typology, by taking away the central courtyard and pushing these household tasks to a corner of the house, took away the Indian woman's visibility and presence. A visibility that had allowed the Indian woman to be vocal in the house and influence decisions with her opinion and active participation. The idea I was most interested with was how the British, as an oppressive group, by trying to impose modernism, fully discredited and ignored the plight of the Indian woman. The conditions this imposed modernism existed on was control, power, and capital only. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you also for talking about your essay. Just a question for all of you. How did you choose your topic? How much do you think you pushed it in terms of daring something which maybe was not safe grounds in putting forward ideas?
I think in my case, I think I was daring from the start because, first of all, I was taking a feminist perspective. I mean, your first question about how we chose this topic, it was based on the course that we chose. So in my case, it was concepts in domesticity. So then from there, I looked at one example of domesticity that I was most interested in and went with that. And then in terms of daring, I think I did dare by taking a feminist perspective as a male myself. And even when I was having these initial discussions, we did bring this up that, you're taking this feminist perspective and you know what this means. I mean, I was always motivated to do it, but I think I personally took this as a challenge to see it from a feminist perspective.
I think that the biggest motivation for me to write about it was originated in my own experience of discovering that the forest is not real. So this discovery came with a few levels of shock, I think, for me, just in front of my ignorance, because I considered myself quite politically aware. And then the understanding that probably other people might not know, and the meanings of that action and the extent of it, that actually it's hard to locate because it's everywhere. Yeah.
I first saw the course for this essay was institutional architecture of welfare with Eleni, and so the idea was to look at, first during the course it was mainly in the UK, state-led projects about education, housing, and healthcare, and then we had to choose a subject, a phenomenon, or a case study, and so I really wanted to try to link the essay to my unit project, and we're looking at flexible, modular spaces, especially for housing. And so, as a native from Paris, I was always intrigued by those constructions that are the grands ensembles, but just from an external point of view, as I've never lived in one of them. And so this essay was an occasion for me to understand them better, and also because, like, from an architecture student position, trying to have a different vantage point than the one used in the main discourse in France, which is that it's just an architectural failure. And writing the essay, I realized that it was more about political, social, economical consequences that led to the degradation of those buildings, and it was really, interesting to understand them. And then also because I love photography, and it was a nice way to work with this aesthetic of this facade.
So my essay started as a conversation with Ed Bottoms in the archives here at school, and he was showing me all these photographs of the pantomimes that the AA used to have, and he was telling me, I said, why are they doing these pantomimes? It's just kind of doesn't really relate to architecture. I don't really understand. he said that, well, probably it's an extension of the British public school culture of like planning every activity and having all of your moments filled with these planned activities, even if it's planned leisure, having a space and a time for that. And that comment sort of, I found that comment quite interesting, and I just went down this rabbit hole. And at the same time, one of my classmates had recommended this book, Homo Ludens, and that got me into play and game theory. So then I had these two things, and through conversations, I was trying to figure out how are these things related, and then building up a body of evidence through conversations with my tutors and Claire as well. So it sort of was a long process to come to this conclusion for me, but yeah, that's how it sort of went.
Thank you, but of course there's part two of the question, if I may, which is asking the question again, because you all have a subtopic or a real message in there. And don't make me word it for you, please. Can you go a bit deeper? Do I need to provoke you?
Maybe I can say something.
I can join if you need.
Go for it. Go for it, Joaquin. Go for it, please do.
Go it.
Please do.
Building on the marvelous question. Imagine that you start doing what I was saying before. You start talking with each other, start listening to each other. Because I think if you just for a second, even now, were listening to what your colleagues were saying, you'd notice that you are all part of a much needed conversation. And suddenly, if we all can be part of that conversation, when I say much needed, I say I need it more than you people. No, I'm not saying that's why I think it's wonderful, the question. Imagine that, now that everybody stated its reasons, imagine that we ask across. What do you think are, each other's reasons for studying a certain thing, or for putting himself in a position of losing ground somehow, ungrounding oneself, to learn, which of course is classically the way you learn. You displace yourself, you change your shoes. Otherwise, you can't listen, not even to yourself. So that would be my question. Can we do a cross answer as a game?
I wonder if they've actually read each other's essays. I see like eyes. Here, let's go to Claire.
Do you guys want to answer? Do you guys want to answer that?
Charlotte, you were going to say something.
Well, I was going to say something about my essay. I did read your guys' essay, but I feel like the reason why we write is not necessarily coming through, if that makes sense, in the essay. So the reason why I wrote actually about play is because I was interested in play and process in my own work. So I'm in Unit 14, and we start from a detail and go up instead of going large and then going back to the detail when we're designing something. So I was really struggling with this process, especially in term 1, because you just have to sort of use your intuition and you play with the material and learn about the material as you work with your hands. And then later you have to post-rationalize the decisions you made. It's like the opposite of what I would normally do, and I found it very, very uncomfortable. But actually, I really think that it was really vital for me to understand the material. I had to do it like that. I didn't have to, but I just found like it was a very interesting way of learning. It's like play and intuition. And so I found like that writing the essay was actually also relevant to my work and to my process, and it helped me to like move forward more. in working on projects that weren't related to HTS. So, yeah.
I understand the second part of the question. I wonder what I really did challenged, but I think I tried to rethink the meaning of life in a place and how the forest allows a superposition in Israel. But I'll have to think about it further, I think.
I think for me personally, the thing that really led me to get into this research was just questioning how, like when I was growing up in India, why things were the way they were. So just looking at the condition of the society in India and why things were the way they were. And growing up, the only answer I got was that the Western world is different because, you know, people have more rights there, etc., and etc. But I think as growing up, I've just formed this own process of mine where I try and understand things from a different perspective. So I think this essay was another process of mine trying to understand why the position of women in India is the way it is today. So I think, yeah, this was just part of a research that I think I'm continuously doing now as an adult.
I think for me the challenge with this essay was not to talk about the aesthetic of those buildings, because for instance for my term 1 essay I was working on Cézanne's watercolors and the place of the natural object in it, so it was really about the aesthetic features, and I was first intrigued by the Grands Ensembles because of their aesthetics, and so I really tried in the method of writing this essay to just focus on the way they were completed and on the architectural method that was used during their completion, and so it helped me to understand why it was a material and social failure, because the architecture was incomplete in a sense because it was starting from the urban scale and not the individual scale in a sense, and so that then this kind of, to realize that, it helped me a lot with my unit project where I'm starting to really start from the housing unit, the individual scale, and then moving to the outside and having this kind of membranes of different layers of intimacy to the public. And so, yeah, that was, I think, the challenge, all these notions.
Yeah, just add one sort of final. There is an essay that I go back when I need to invent the space to figure out, to listen, to others, which is Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp. It's a very old essay. Architects have been liking it. It's probably one of the very few early pieces of queer writing. And every time I read it, I have a wonderful opportunity never to naturalize anything, never to take anything for granted, if it's play, if it's settlement, if it's the Grands Ensembles, or if it's the role of women. For a second, for every disassembling, there is a heavy naturalization within the other roles also that hunts us. That's why this kind of a endless joy on artifice, on camp, on not or unregulated bad taste, even if we want. And the joy of thinking with writing, which of course Susan Sontag, as you imagine, thinks better than me and writes way better than me. So I'll leave it as take it for a spin, and go back to the essays. I think it will make for a playful, in the full sense, addition to your own research. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in. Building on from what Joachim said, but going back to something that Sacha said, and that ties in with Michal, and then I feel like ties in with everybody. It's for me something about these 4 essays. There is, of course, the listening component, which I agree with, listening to each other. But there's a difficulty that comes before that, I think, which is reading one's own writing and being able to read one's own work, which is extremely difficult. So to have the conversation with somebody else, to have the conversation with one's own work, is the first, for me, difficulty in the first place. And Sacha, you said this, becoming a reader of, reading and being a reader and a writer while you're writing. I think the 4 essays succeed in that extremely well. You're all trying, I feel in all the pieces, that you're all trying to be readers of the topic that you're choosing and put that into writing. So I want to commend you all on that very strongly. Michal, and going into that kind of crossover between reader and writer, there's a rhetorical moment in your essay when you end your presentation on it, and I was so pleased that you did that, which was the sentence, just as forests erase memories, memories erase forests. And there's that's called a chiasmic, it's an example of rhetoric, but it's a chiasmic rhetoric where 2 things are crossed by mirroring each other. This cross, I felt like all of the essays were crossing something that perhaps shouldn't have been crossed, but that needed to be crossed. Aakarsh, from the moment for me where you're talking about, British, obviously the whole topic, but British feminists reading Indian Global South feminists, or women, is a kind of a elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. But that crossing of 2 things that look the same, look very similar, but are completely worlds apart. There's a work by American philosopher called Serene Carter, who's got a fantastic book called Universalizing, what is her title? Universalizing, Decolonizing Universalization. And this decolonization of the universal experience, I think, would be absolutely great for your work. Michal, the rhetorical advice of crossing the 2 things, I think, is absolutely just, I think that encapsulates your entire work. And it's not only a rhetorical device in the writing, but it encaptures this space where things that should not be in one place are presented to exist in that one place. So not only are you doing it in the writing itself rhetorically is practicing the analysis that you're making of your topic, which I thought from a writing point of view is fantastic. Sacha, I thought at the end of the same with your piece, that I thought the cross of the view, the photography, the perspective of the surface and the outside was beautiful. And this amazing thing that you do at the end where you're crossing the verticality and the horizontality of the private dwelling with the collective dwelling in terms of its verticality and its horizontality, and the questions that begs and still begs today, I thought that crossing was amazing as well. Charlotte's this beautiful overlapping of perspectives of play, of schools of play, that you kind of in a literary way hone in terms of satire, something I think that this place could do a lot with. I thought that was absolutely beautiful, and this crossing of the 3 things, of reading those 3 things in the work to understand how play itself comes about from a architectural and pedagogical point of view, I thought was very good. So that moment of putting things together and not just putting them parallel but crossing them over and cross-fertilizing, I thought that was I loved that aspect of all of the work, so well done.
Yeah, just to build on that, because my question was about conclusions, and you all had really different ways of concluding. Super engaging topics and beautiful writing, but I struggled to conclude architectural writing. And it's not just that it's the essay form. I think PhD students struggle to write the conclusion. And it seems a kind of forced or artificial, fairly abstract expectation. It follows sort of narrative traditions or literary ones, and yet in architecture you're still meant to have some form of conclusion. But most of your papers, like a lot of architectural writing, is about revelation, the archival work, the unpacking something, the comparison, this kind of sense of discovery, and then to suddenly have to conclude it effectively. This was where I was quite amazed at how you got around the problem. Now, some people who are struggling to conclude an essay are told, well, go back and repeat the introduction, but that's no help. I mean, I don't know about you, but if you write in a linear way, to go back to the introduction when you didn't even have the revelation yet seems a bore. But yeah, these kind of methods of sort of skirting or allowing different forms of conclusion happen seems really worthwhile. And I think connects up to this notion of how do you write to an object or an archive. You were explicitly in the archive with Ed, a bit of primary research, amazing. But for the last 2 years, most people haven't had access to real archives. So there's been a lot of secondary research or online elements. And I don't know if, like, the photography you had, where did that come from? Was it archival? Was it online? And by now it's a blend anyway. Most archives are digitizing. But how do you work with this notion of archive? Or do you think about primary or secondary levels of research? Because I think architects are often, it's a limbo. You don't mind bringing in a bibliography to show secondary research and analysis, but some of your objects are so distinctive, they're a revelation, or they're novel to the reader, or primary. But you went to a real archive. Did any of the rest of you, where did you get your films, for example? How did you come across those in the first instance?
The film was shown in a film festival in Israel, I think, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. So that's where I saw it and just remembered it, because I already felt for this topic.
That fueled a million other things. And the grand ensemble photography, would you ever want to do a photo essay, just your own observations? Because those photos are so totalizing in a way, right? The first and second and third iterations, that was a beautiful triptych. But what do you think of, are there great archives for this kind of work? Because in this country there aren't, because these things haven't been valued very much until recently. So I'm just curious, did you ever find an archive or a resource, even if it's online, that allowed you to go deep?
So I haven't been a lot in the archives for this essay. For instance, the series I showed at the beginning of the presentation by Laurent Cronenthal, I knew it for a long time because I've been to the exhibition, and so that was the way, because of photography. And then the other images, that's a more regular searching method on GStore, finding for sources. But I should check. I don't know if the AA has some archives about French grand ensemble of the 60s, 70s, but yeah.
Because tutors were traveling and sending back their slides. It'd be amazing. You probably were looking at lots of drawings rather than photographs, the plan and the courtyard.
Yeah, I think most of my research came from written essays and drawings and comparisons. But I think for me, now that I hear all the other people talking about how when they thought of the topic, they came across that this is something that they'd watched before. For me, this was a completely different process where as I mentioned before, that my methodology was of my own research as well. It was a quest because I did not know anything about this before. So for me, everything that I found online was completely new to me. So yeah, it's nothing before.
Thanks all four.
Really impressive range of topics, and how accomplished the writing and presentations, which again were very different from the essays themselves. So I wanted to congratulate you on that. And I picked up in when you were presenting and also in your writing, there were certain exceptionally eloquent phrases which in a kind of, they could go towards perhaps not conclusion, but maybe kind of pinpointing one of the strands of the arguments. And I was thinking when Charlotte, when you were talking, there was something kind of in essence contradictory about planning the play and how, you know, everything had to be kind of formally arranged and predicted, and yet also to allow for unusual and unexpected and chance to happen. And also I had a kind of question for you, whether we need to distinguish between play and dance, because definitely in some of the Bauhaus examples, that was much more about formal dance. For Sacha, I was stricken by the phrase excessive efficiency, which is, again is a contradiction in how perhaps you're coming at a similar argument, but from an entirely different kind of angle, and alluding to the sense of kind of loss of sense of individuality, which was then maybe reclaimed through these private gardens. With Michal's Forests in Reverse, and also New Israeliness, which I thought was just really powerful, and with Aakarsh, with invisibility, or making kind of normalizing colonization visible. So I just wanted to invite you, if you could, to kind of expand a little bit, or maybe suggest some other kind of arguments or phrases that you wish to highlight.
So your question, what is the difference between play and dance, in this case for the triadic ballets? Well, actually the footage I showed is not original footage. It was, the choreography was recorded, and then later in the 60s and 70s they also reproduced this ballet. So the people dancing that we see are trained dancers. They didn't create the dance, they're just following what has already been created before. So I would not consider that play, actually. I think play is actually the process of creating this dance together, and decide. So when Oskar Schlemmer and his students were creating this, they were deciding the rules. They were basing the movements on mathematics, on the proportions of the body. So they were experimenting themselves with their own bodies. The dancers were the students, and sometimes Oskar Schlemmer himself. So to me, that's what makes it play. And everyone involved, they can leave at any time. They chose to participate in this, and it follows like all of the definition that I decided to use to define play. So to me, that's what makes these things different. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, about this excessive efficiency, that goes a bit with what you were saying with the opposition of verticality and horizontality, with this nice sentence from Lacaton Vazal, which says that for a similar social condition, a house is just a well-designed flat in the middle of a garden. And so I don't know if I was trying to justify myself that I didn't want to oppose, by defending a bit the consensus, I didn't want to oppose the house and the flat. And so when I was mentioning this excessive efficiency, I think that was maybe related to our unit project, when we're looking for the most cost-effective, the most efficient way to build prefabricated units. And so I was maybe trying to challenge myself to go a bit in the opposite way that the unit was telling us to do sometimes. But I think that expression came after the tables, actually, because that was
Forest in Reverse maybe would link to me trying to touch the elusive artificiality or the false naturality that the forest implies, because time would be maybe the most inevitable. So just clicking the reverse speed in Premiere would be some way of giving presence to this. The new Israeliness links to the idea that people came from different localities, and the main mission was to find what we're about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think visibility, as I mentioned, I think is one of the most important topics in the entirety of my essay, because I start with like the main comparison between the pre-colonial houses and the colonial houses is based on the visibility of the Indian woman inside the domestic spaces. And then I not only, like my whole essay doesn't only just, is not based only on that, but I also end with saying that, you know, this visibility is now being converted into a good thing, where this, whatever happened, is leading a new wave of Indian feminist writing. So I think visibility, in that sense as well, I also meant that, you know, the visibility is not only just the physical visibility, but the visibility of voices, of Indian feminist voices in current writing. And the talk about normalizing colonization, I think I have one whole paragraph of my essay about how this concept of normalizing what was happening to the Indian people was used against the Indian woman especially. So, for example, one of the things that I talk about is how during the Industrial Revolution, all the jobs were taken away from the Indian businessmen, and they were put into farmers, etc. And what that did was create this situation where the Indian man did not have jobs. And what he did in return was try to take that frustration out on the Indian woman. So, like this use of normalizing what was happening to them and then shifting the blame from the colonizers to the Indian male was used as a very important tactic when it comes to British colonialism. Yeah.
I'm going to ask to pass on to Nick as our final comment, because unfortunately I am going to have to call time on this.
I'm going to be super duper fast. I really like this bunch, so I really wanted to say something, because I think you're right to keep 4 in. Let's get nice range. So super fast. I'm going to go backwards. Aakarsh, perhaps the most academic of the essays, genuinely scholarly piece of writing. But that also opens it up to scholarly critique. So I'm going to ask you 2 quick questions. One is, did colonial etiquette books get directly incorporated into housing design? I think that's very important. I think that's the potential to really take your point home. And then the second quick question is, you sort of, in a way, fall victim to your own critique, which is that the colonial process is a geographically flattening process, and there's a sense that you flatten the landscape as we try to understand it today. So you use Mughal examples as a lens to read West Bengal or Calcutta, right? So regionalism is fundamental. I wonder how regionalism affects your argument today. Who was this? Michal. Dynamic, provocative essay as praxis, right? As theory and practice at once, right? And I wonder whether your essay almost read as if it was going in reverse a bit, and I wonder if that was on purpose. So when we talked about the kind of chiasmatic moment, for me, the prickly pear was the kind of inflection point. So I wonder if you could just say in one sentence what the prickly pear is, and if you could have started your essay with the prickly pear. Sacha, an ensemble, a buffet of ideas. Really interesting case studies. I really enjoyed it. Here too, you end with Lacaton Vassal. So you open it up as a kind of point of interest, but I wonder what would Lacaton I wonder if you could have told the story through the point of view of Lacaton Vassal. So how do they read the ensemble of buildings, the ensemble of ensembles that you discuss? Okay, so what do they say about that range of things? And then finally, Charlotte, I think this was a spectacularly well-crafted essay. It was incisive in its blend of primary sources, case studies from the archive, theory, your use of Huizinga was spot on, and its implications for anarchism, anarchist thinking, horizontal democratic processes is spot on. I would highly recommend an essay by David Graeber, the anthropologist anarchist, called "What's the Point If We Can't Have Fun?" And I want to ask you, do you think the AA is living up to, in this moment of horizontal democracy, do you think the AA is living up to its legacy of play, and how should it? Thank you.
I'm going to be a real buzzkill, and I will not give you the opportunity to answer. But please find Nick, answer these questions. But I want to thank you all. I'm sorry to cut it short. I just want to make sure we have time for our third years as well. So thank you, round of applause. And
hi everyone, I am very, very pleased to be here presenting my essay entitled Knowing the Brick Wall, a semiotic disjunction between the making and the knowing. The essay is about the transmission of practical knowledge disseminated by the French Encyclopedia of Arts and Crafts, written by Diderot and D'Alembert. The Encyclopedia is seen as the knowledge transmission apparatus par excellence. However, I will be demonstrating its impracticality to impart technical knowledge by deciphering the masonry plate that narrates how to build a brick wall. The plate is divided into two parts, 1/3 dedicated to a tableau vivant and 2/3 depicting a tabulation of different brick wall laying methods and typologies. To classify human knowledge, Diderot and D'Alembert created a map where the entire human knowledge is ordered and connected under 3 faculties, which my presentation will follow. The map represents the general distribution of human knowledge into history, which is related to memory, into philosophy, which emanates from reason, and into poetry, which arises from imagination. The plate aimed to transfer the technical knowledge needed to perform brick walls. Nevertheless, by reading the plate, we are unable to learn how to construct a brick wall. The written and illustrated material remain insufficient to impart knowledge as they bypass tacit knowledge that has an elusive character and is seen only by its action. Gilbert Ryle, in his essay Knowing How and Knowing That, the presidential address, says, "There is a distinction between the museum possession and the workshop possession of knowledge. Knowledge emerging from the domain of memory can only deal with facts, the knowing that, whereas knowledge deriving from experience is able to show the way things are done, the knowing how. The encyclopedia intellectualizes knowledge by neglecting the tacit dimension embedded in the making of things." The tableau vivant shows clearly this contradiction in its triptychal composition. The symmetry of the tableau vivant conveys an opposition between the traditional rural lifestyle and, on the other side, progress brought by the Enlightenment. The passage from ignorance to progress is done through scientific knowledge, represented by craftsmen situated in the very middle of the scene. They perhaps represent the thinker, the architect of the construction site. Thus, the craftsmen become objects and no longer genesis of knowledge and portray the division between the body and the intellect. Surprisingly enough, when mirrored, the tableau vivant's compositional analysis reveals that it follows the knowledge grid. It has been drawn the way it is mirrored, but the lithographic printing method inverted the image during its printing process. The intellectualization of practical knowledge is at the origin of its fragmentation and diminishing. Knowledge transforms into a poetic, oniric, and Romanesque image that ingrains in itself signs and their infinite vibrations. The semiotic reading of the plate is subject to many interpretations. According to Barthes, we read signs differently because of time breach. He writes, "There is a depth in the encyclopedic image, the very depth of time, which transforms the object into myth. This leads to what we must call the poetic of the encyclopedic image, if we agree to define poetics as the sphere of the infinite vibrations of meaning, at the center of which is placed the literal object." Thus said, the transmission of knowledge through a tableau vivant can be questioned in terms of its correctness. The contemporary reader will have a different preliminary knowledge compared to the 18th century subject. Therefore, we'll have a different understanding of the illustrated craft, as each experience comes with a bundle of feelings, remembrance, and perception that make tacit knowledge personal and unique. The human knowledge grid sets limits between knowledge domains, though there seems to have leakages, moments of tacit knowledge, and one must say these obscure knowledge areas are intangible in the encyclopedic plates, yet they are primordial in the understanding of knowledge. So I would like to ask if today, by doing this verbal presentation, I achieved to transmit my knowledge in this question of knowledge. And I would like to end my presentation with the words of the philosopher Polanyi, who writes, "We can know more than we can tell." Thank you. And lastly, I would like to thank Klaus Platzgummer, as my essay has been developed in his course, and special thanks to Claire for helping me with the writing center.
Hello everyone, my name is Jay, and I'm honored to receive the shortlist nomination for my essay entitled The Shape of Clay. I am humbled to be here along these talented writers. The origins of architecture are based upon myth. The first architecture, which has by now long disappeared, can only be materialized in storytelling. As the definition of architecture expands to encompass not just the built environment, but the material imagination, the old tropes of architectural myth are primed for reinvention. For centuries, Lauget's primitive hut has endured as the seminal myth, but relies too heavily on the formal expression of classicism to exist as a truly transcendental archetype. It proposes that architecture began with the built form. Instead, this essay argues towards a formless origin, explored allegorically through the clay myth of creation. Almost every culture throughout history has positioned clay at the center of their creation story. Sumerian creationism circa 1600 BCE posits the emergence of humankind from a mixture of clay and the blood of a god. Egyptian, Greek, Islamic, Maori, alongside many other mythologies, describe the first humans shaped from clay in the divine image of a higher being. We must conceive of the origins of architecture in the same breath as the origin of humans, because the division between subject and object, which is also the recognition of place, emerges from consciousness. The revelation I am also means I am here, which is the first assertion of dwelling and perhaps the first architectural imaginary. This mental architecture, or material imagination, is described by Gaston Bachelard as an essential paste, a primal clay well suited for receiving and keeping the forms of all things. A material image, so simple, so intense, so alive, that it is naturally preyed upon by concepts and might harden into forms such as the primitive hut, which seem infallible but become brittle in their hardening. By pushing this metaphor and exploring clay in its various forms, raw clay, brick, and dust, I hope to allude to the fact that creation, the main aspiration of architecture, is inexorably linked to destruction. Wet dust becomes clay when fired turns to brick and weathered reduces back into dust. This cycle is paramount to human life. Perceptually formless, we first exist as particulate matter drifting in embryonic uncertainty. We then emerge from the world, wet and lumpy, our brains primed for change. Eventually, we form our own beliefs, our skin thickens, and our sense of self solidifies. Those who resist this pull remain eternally young, but all matter is subject to entropy. Our light slowly fades until it is a candle flicker, one stiff breath from eternal nightfall. In our passing, we are returned to the earth and restart our process of becoming, first humbly as worm fodder, then perhaps as the buds of a cherry blossom or the bark of a sturdy redwood. By extension, I have tried to craft a definition of architecture contingent upon the transformation of matter, of animate things rather than passive objects, to implicate more fully its coexistence with humanity. The clay myth requires new consideration in a world of abundance, profoundly lacking in meaning. The secularization of modern culture, driven by the assertion that empiricism constitutes the only legitimate form of knowledge, has seen the exploration of spirituality supplanted by the pursuit of material accumulation. In short, empiricism promises truth in what is observable, what is material, creating false idols out of answers instead of questions. Myth needs to regain traction within the broader conversation of architecture. For nearly the entire history of human existence, myth has been the foundation of meaning. Today, it seems to be lost in the preoccupation with deadlines and billable hours. Myth today struggles to gain a foothold in modern culture because for too long, people have conflated connotation with denotation. This is to say, our error in reading myth is a matter of confusing metaphor and fact, a byproduct of our empiricist conditioning. Rationalizing the world leaves no room for contemplating the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the transcendental mystery of existence. In The Power of Myth, Joseph Campbell describes how meaning first arose from shared stories. These myths explore the core afflictions in being human. Where do we come from, and what is our purpose? The clay myth addresses the former through a monist assertion that there is one basic entity rippling through all things. Simply put, we are all made from the same stuff. Georges Bataille calls this base matter. Bachelard describes an ideal paste. But what you are all probably convinced of by now is the atom conceived by Epicurus 2,300 years ago. I talk of clay, not atoms, to allow subjective displacement by way of metaphor. It is my hope that reading this essay allows you to contemplate your own personal myth. For me, temporary existence within an eternal process of becoming and unbecoming allows me to feel grounded in both the physical and the metaphysical. I am of the world, yet nothing at all. So too is the shape of clay. Thank you.
Hi, yeah. Hi, I'm Chengxuan, and it's also my honor to present this essay to you. And as I'm starting with Walter Benjamin in his The Arcades project, which some of you might be very familiar with, it is regarded as an unfinished magnum opus of him, which, as he puts it, is the ruin where all his struggles and ideas are situated. And it writes that in modern life, we have grown very poor in threshold experiences. Falling asleep might be the only experience that remains. But together with that, there is also the process of waking up. And the thresholds must be carefully distinguished from the boundary. It is a zone, it is a transformation, it is a passage. It is not only a physical situation, but also a temporal one, where reflections and contemplations take place. The threshold between dreaming and awakening becomes the dialectic device or organ through which historical knowledge is made accessible. Michelet notes somewhere that each great epoch dreams of the one that follows. The arcades, which were totally anew and alien to the age of Charles Fourier, are first envisioned by him in the phalanstery model, as you see in here, as a commune, as a gigantic domicile, as a wish images, as dreams of a utopia where individuals could evacuate from the drudgery of their social relations, their burdens, their labor, and thus get cleansed and sublimated in a place of otherness by being secluded while working and living together under the same glazed canopy. While when Benjamin years afterwards revisits this model, he sees the arcades and manages to catch retrospectively the fleeting continents of the phantasmagorical landscape of the dreams of Fourier, which has been historically as well as geographically situated in the arcades in Paris. What remains there were only the ruins, the traces, the after-images of the dream. Instead, the arcade did strive as a typology in the 19th century, but turned out to be the material celebration of the urban modernism and the infrastructure of commodity exchange. In Mark Pimlaw terms, it is a public interior. Thus, Benjamin adds to Michelet by saying that not only does each epoch dream of the one that follows, in so dreaming process, it precipitates its awakening. And I would argue this is a mode of dialectical thinking, which clearly shows that perhaps not too much, but at least some affinity of Benjamin's thinkings with Hegelian and Marxist traditions. The repertoire of each epoch-defining moments of the 19th century history reveals themselves through the spatial device of the Paris arcades. Here, the material substrate and the whole edifice of the superstructure interpenetrate, illuminating each other, contributing to the awakening from the wish images by the predecessors, by Fourier, and the dissipation of their dream elements. This fluid threshold historically situated between the dreaming and awakening is believed as the means in which the spirit or Geist, in Hegelian terms, precedes and evokes itself. Well, Geist is particularly a difficult word to mention in English because it doesn't have a corresponding translation. However, there are at least 3 words that has the same root with it. It's the ghost, the gist, and the geyser. I would conclude in these terms that the Geist is the consciousness of the world that lies ghostly in the ulterior of the rational thought, however rises like gases coming out from the geyser when approached to. It summarizes the leading gist behind all immaterial and material manifestation of the world history, and the whole of which is the coming to self-knowledge of the Geist. What goes on in the process of human history then is a process of sublation of the world spirit, or in the term world Geist, of keeping what is true and what is viable in the particular stage of human conscious development, while in doing so only to find the contradictions, to find the impasse, the standstills, the stasis conditions. They turn out to be fruitful because when the contradictions and limitations are thought through, it generates and preserves what is viably true and repeats this process. Each new awareness and knowledge of the consciousness itself solves existing problems, but alas, generates new fields of inquiries, new finitudes, and new limitations. This is the ad infinitum process of dialectics of thought. The history is the Geist coming to the knowledge about its own consciousness and continence by telling itself, by talking to itself incessantly. People of our ages would explore the arcades and the public interior as a typology in this way. The restored Paris arcades of our ages still function as dream worlds, but now instead of celebrating the urban modernity in itself, they provide fantasies of escaping from it. They are the after-images of Benjamin's wish images and the residuals of his arcades. And they are the situations and wishes closer to our contemporaries. What is at stake here is the analysis of the public interior under this context, under this tradition situated inside the ruins of our predecessors, through the dialectic lens, through the synthesis, through the threshold between dreaming and awakening, wish images and their negations. And this essay is exactly the departure point for this goal. And it makes no sense to divide the era of capitalism into the so-called formalist modernism and historically eclectic postmodernism, as the paradoxical dynamics and cyclic nature of novelty and repetition simply repeats themselves anew and fall into the eternal loop of falling asleep and waking up. Modernism and postmodernism in their terms are not chronological eras, but dialectical positions and temporary emphases in the struggle and sublation of the world spirit. If modernism or wish images of the people that precedes us expresses such idea through the so-called utopia or utopian longing by anticipating the reconciliation of the social function and aesthetic forms, the idea and projects of our contemporaries would instead acknowledge their non-identity and keep their fantasies alive. The advancement and evolution of the consciousness lie in the threshold in between, where both theses are rendered volatile. They lie in the questioning of the questionable truths only to make accessible new levels of knowledge about themselves, thus raising new questions. And this presentation is merely introduction to this essay, but is the most important part of it because it's nothing other than explanation of the modus operandi, of the system that justifies all the knowledge made accessible through the experimental approaches in this essay. The rest of the essay looks at the public interior, spaces across history, across London, from literature references, from architecture references, etc., and examines the various types of people, types of activities and space that take stage in this caesura. However, they are just a starting point for continuous non-stop labor on this topic. Thank you.
Hey guys, thanks so much. It's just so interesting to see this bird's eye view on all the kind of production of writing that's happening here, because there's this very clear evolution that's pronounced, right? So it's like the first years, there's like kind of like crawling and kind of just grappling with things. Second years are like walking around exploring. And you guys are like sprinting. Sprinting, so it's almost as if you are all three possessed by the spirit of the main author that you are grappling with. So it's like we have Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, and Walter Benjamin sitting before us, right? And they read like that, especially you. Your essay read like the Arcades Project. It was like I was reading the Arcades Project. And on the same token, the fact that you each gave the best presentations, maybe, because you had to explain yourselves. So you gave essays about the essay in the presentation. You're like, this is what I'm actually doing. So it's a very interesting thing. You're almost performing the mode of, fully embodying the mode of thought and then performing it, and then here explaining, this is what I was doing. So I was very happy to see you doing that because it shows that you're aware of what you're doing. But maybe you're running too soon as well, right? That's normal. It's third year, part one, get the prize maybe, then next start over again, part two. But just to get into details. All right, so I'm gonna refer to you guys as Michel, Jacques, and Walter, okay? So Michel, right? In your archaeology of knowledge, right? Looking at this image, right? You use the word tacit, right? In Michael Polanyi's use of understanding, effectively what is a rupture between another way of understanding knowledge, the episteme and the techne, right? So the techne is kind of craft knowledge in the Aristotelian definition, craft knowledge, and the episteme is kind of intellectualized knowledge, or kind of interiorized knowledge. And I think you're very, very, very astute at doing that. What you're doing, though, is you're doing art history, actually, I think. And you're looking at the social function of these images. And so there are three kind of things that I would encourage you to think about and maybe comment about. One is Michael Polanyi has a very, very well-known, interesting brother, Karl Polanyi, who wrote about economic embeddedness, so how capitalism divorces craft from society. So I think this would be a totally other way of approaching it through his brother, which may be interesting. The second is that in the Aristotelian definition of knowledge, there's a third form of knowledge, which is phronesis, a kind of practical wisdom. So I wonder how that third one fits in the rupture between the techne and the episteme, or what you call the tacit. And the third, I think the most important one, just from a kind of art historical point of view, is, who is the audience for the encyclopedia? You argue that it kind of destroys craft, right? It actually has a force on the world. But are the craftsmen the audience, or is it a kind of elite person? So when we're doing art history, you always have to remember patronage and reception, not just the object. So, these would be ways, I think, to push the story further. Jacques. So, extremely exciting essay. I mean, you really go for it, and I really, really appreciate that. And you do this kind of total psychoanalysis of materiality. And at the same time, you divorce Jacques from the Marxism behind it, which is fine. But there's no class. And that's okay, but I'm just throwing that out there. I love the idea of a psychopath's guide to conservation, which probably requires divorcing Jacques from class in a way, right? I love that idea. And I just encourage you to go for it and cook it like clay. My question is, or what I thought about when I was reading your essay, is you said to remain modernist, to remain undefined, right? So what you're clearly interested in, and you say this in your explanation of your essay, is demystification and modernity, right? And what you're doing in your essay, much like Jacques Lacan, is you're writing as a process of enchantment, which is awesome. I mean, it's exciting. I don't want to demystify your own essay in saying this, but I would just encourage you to look at the history of how people have thought about modernity and disenchantment, specifically Max Weber, but how maybe he missed the point, and there's a whole series of ways of thinking about that we still circulate within modes of enchantment all the time. I mean, capital being the fetish, commodity being like the most famous one, but also many, many other things. So what I like is that, in a way, by avoiding postmodernism, all three of you, which is like, enchantment becomes Disneyland in Vegas, you've opened the door for understanding new forms of enchantment, which I think we all need, right? Otherwise, you become a kind of Trump voter. Third, Walter, the most Walter of them all, extremely Waltery. Practical question, which translation of Arcades Project are you reading? Is it Susan Buck Morris's, or is it another one? Is the green one?
No, it's the black cover.
Okay, so I encourage you to read the green one, firstly. You mentioned dialectics in your talk, but you do not in the paper, in the essay. You talk about standstill. The expression is dialectics at a standstill that Walter deploys. So this is again interesting. I wonder if dialectics in your essay would have just driven the point further for you. You talk about world spirit, but not about capitalism, but you do in your talk. The world spirit is, of course, capitalism. So it's just interesting this. You've kind of removed yourself from some of the vocabulary and deployed it in the explanation. It just means you're aware of it. So I'm just very, very happy about that. I'm very interested in this kind of performative mode of writing that you're doing. I guess my question for you is, I'm talking too much. Sorry. My question for you is, you've totally ignored like the metaverse. And when we talk to the Arcades project today, like, is it the metaverse? And you've kind of, in the way, flattened that. And I think that's actually really important. You said kind of, yeah, okay, like, we've always been at a standstill. Everyone talks about Instagram as like creating this like hyper-repetitive, like numbing of culture, but actually Walter Benjamin was saying this about the Arcades project. So I mean, what is it about today that matters? What is it about Benjamin that matters today, right? I'm still trying to figure out where you're going with that. Why, just to show that we haven't actually moved on? Is that the actual point? So that's it. I'm sorry, too much.
Yeah, just to build on that, that was incredible, thank you. If we're talking about stages of evolution of writing within an HTS program, I think it's interesting to draw out that at that stage, you're sort of having a walk with a notable author. And that walk is then inflected by if it's in a translation. So that question about the translation makes sense, or Foucault. But I think it's absolutely necessary. We all get to that stage where we have to obsess about a given author, because I think it's part of learning this craft, if you will. Which brings me to my real question, which sounds superficial, but I think at this stage, the way I read the essays, style is a bad word in units, but a stylist, in a literary sense, maybe not so bad. What I was seeing was a kind of style mapped out, which relates to the author you're obsessed with, but is also you becoming an author where, if just as a sort of point of departure, if we think of a stylist in maybe popular literature, like Woodhouse, right? Open any page of any Woodhouse book, you can kind of fall into a joy of just reading it for his style, let alone where you are in the plot. And I could say the same of some of your essay pages. So I'm curious if you're consciously, at this stage, working on a style or an approach to writing that is very mobile. You would take it to other projects, or is it about taking that walk with the object or the author you're studying and playing this game that we're reading into where you sublimate or you begin to work through that author to develop a style? But for me, it's really, I think we all do it, and that you're at this stage is really interesting for me. I'm sure Claire has a take on style as well. More of a comment, wasn't it? Yeah.
Thank you so much for, again, extremely accomplished work and presentations. I have a question which is kind of more, I think, light and I guess in some ways practical, but I think quite important, which is to do with the use of drawing and images and analysis, and in your case, actually doing the drawings yourself, where they don't stay as illustrations, but they become part of the argument itself. So I'll let you, perhaps, Jay, maybe if you could answer. And also, if you could talk a little bit about one of the titles of your drawing, which was The Psychopath's Guide to Conservation.
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's a particular point in my essay where I discuss this phenomenon of facadism, which is quite rampant in where I'm from in Toronto, but also here, where for people listening that aren't familiar, maybe, essentially the exterior of the building is left standing while the rest of the building is demolished. And I, throughout the essay, kind of relate this to the image of Buffalo Bill, who is a fictional character, or real, I can't remember, essentially skinning a victim and then wearing the mask. And when you have this image of a building that has done the same thing, there's this kind of very visceral, gruesome reaction that I feel when I see that, because it's essentially reducing the value of heritage to simply how it looks, and it's very blatant in doing that. So I think when I was making the drawing, I wanted to demonstrate this process, because you can only do so much with writing. But seeing it as this kind of three-stage step, I wanted it to refer to this process of transformation that I talk about, and what I've talked about today in the essay and in this speech, where our buildings aren't static objects, and eventually they adopt a form that is perhaps not what is intended by the designer. It also, at a certain point, ends up decaying, which is its own kind of, where the matter itself has its own vibrancy, its own agency. Yeah, I wonder if that answers your question.
Good, nice. I just wanted to say thank you very much, because I found the three of you really interesting to read. And something that maybe is a chance that maybe you missed a little bit is reflection on the structure, that I think all of your topics were open to an interest in the structure. I thought in Daphne's case, it's a very conscious use of, so you're taking Roland Barthes and he's reading, and one of the elements he comments about is the idea of framing, how frames are very important for the tableau vivant or for the encyclopedic project. And that's something that you're doing. You're taking images, cropping them, taking frames. But I was wondering to what degree this idea of framing and cropping a reality, you're using it to subvert the project of the encyclopedia or not. It's true that you're not taking the semiotic signs, let's say like the objects, but you're taking the actions and arguing that tacit knowledge is the important thing that is missing. But on the structure that you're doing, you're very much following the encyclopedic project in that you're first presenting us the very large picture, the whole structure of your essay, and then you go bit by bit, a bit the way that the encyclopedia is taking us the whole of the knowledge, and then bit by bit. So I was wondering if reversing completely your structure by starting from within the frame and opening up later might be a good way of reversing or subverting that. So just tweaking a bit the structure by flipping it the other way around might have interesting. In the same way, I was thinking in Jay's case, I thought it was beautiful how you move from clay, brick, dust, and you do this continuous cycle that you comment about. And then in the structure, there is one moment which is, how do you enter that inner world? And you do it through an introduction, which I think is fine. But I think because you're wondering all the time about where is the meaning, where is that? And I think it's precisely in that becoming formless or becoming form. And I think the meaning in your essay would have been interesting if there is no introduction. You just enter it, and you just move between the three. So I found that the introduction was like something that should have been within, and then how you end in the beginning again, it could have been a bit more elaborate, I think. And in your case, I think, again, this idea of interiority, it was, for me, it was a bit hard to enter your project, partly because it was long, and it's true that it produced that certain kind of dream-like feeling that we were moving in these different places. But I don't know how much you were in control, or you were giving the structure that you were following to Walter Benjamin, and you were just following too much his structure of an endless project, let's say. But I thought that it would be good if you reflect on, or I don't know if you had a chance of reflecting on structurally, how do I take the reader through my argument? But that's something that might be beneficial for the future. Nice.
Yeah, on that note, I think all three of you should write up your presentation as an essay for your essay, like the manual. Just to pick up on that, like if you wrote up your 5 minutes and then attached it as like an instruction manual to read the essay, that'd be an interesting kind of experiment. So.
Well, okay.
It's Joaquin.
Oh, does Joaquin want to say something?
Yeah, I think so. Go ahead, and then shall we do Claire and then you, Joaquin? I don't know if you can go first.
Okay, maybe I'll just make a brief comment. There was an opportunity I thought that could be brought into your work, and it was about glass. The Arcades project, the other, this kind of idea of another world possibly existing. And also kind of tying that into Geist, spirit of the age, the epoch, having a presentiment of what is going to come. There's in the tiny village of Yorkshire in this country in 1827, the Bronte sisters are concocting a world called the Glass Room, and they make this whole story and world which is a presentiment of the Crystal Palace, of Les Halles, marketplace in Paris, and so this is in 1827, so completely before all of that is happening. So this sense of the Geist being this having this translucent sense of possibility, of ephemerality, glass to me, the Geist and the glass embody those two kind of things in a materiality and in a philosophical sense. That I wondered whether that could be some kind of draw some materiality into the work that allows us not only to read it from a different point of view, for the lens of making a new connection or original connection in the work, and just and thinking about stories that practicing this idea of if the epoch thinks before, find the examples of time where these things have been previsioned. I thought that could give a nice line to the work. Both other pieces I thought were great. That's just one comment.
Joaquim, I'm so sorry. Oh my God. Joaquim, shall we move to you? Sorry about that.
I'll just have to run as usual to finish some other exhibition. But I was kind of listening to all those very articulated relations, always remembering the quote that the very grumpy Carlos Scarpa wrote at the entrance of the architecture school in Venice, the verum ipsum factum. And it was always a wonderful remembering each time we stepped into the school. The truth is made, or the truth is in the making, which was always a kind of a very Byzantine way of old Scarpa returning to his critics that said that he didn't have a degree. So if you want to see my credentials, check them, in the Jean-Baptiste Vico quote. Sometimes it's good to go back to our own craft a little bit, even in writing sometimes. I was a bit put off by some complexity of language that I'm not sure that, sometimes we could articulate in a clear way, the old assumption that truth is made and is in the making. That's a bit the craft of architecture. Other than it's just to be a bit in the world, but showing it and seeing it our own particular way as architects. And nonetheless, thank you very much. I really congratulate everybody. Thank you, and I just had to rush. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
So maybe what I'll do, I'll give it, hold on, I have it on a timer here. I've got 4 minutes and 30 seconds of conversation left to you. So I invite a few. We're okay?
I guess tacit knowledge, I guess it reminded me of the thinking hand and thinking from doing. I think thinking hand is like a bit by Pelasma. It really reminded me of that, I guess. I guess clay, passion for destruction, is also creative passion, which is what Bakunin said. Constant destruction, constant creation, right? And with dream, I guess it reminded me of Heidegger and his essay, Question of Concerning Technology, where he links technology to the word aletheia in Greek, which means revealing. And the dangers of technology is that it well, it reveals, but then it can also enframe. And I guess maybe you can say the same thing about dreams. And maybe we've forgotten how to dream, do you think?
What's the last?
I guess we've been enframed in a dream.
Yeah.
So we kind of like haven't got to the revealing part again, which is like dreaming again. Do you think we've forgotten how to dream?
Well, I believe, as I have mentioned before, I think it's it is constantly cycling between the two, between the negation of a dream and the dream itself, or the realization of the dream of a dream itself. It is like waking up from a dream to the next, if you take this metaphor forward. And I am somehow familiar with Heidegger's text on technology as well, and if I'm going to incorporate that into my into this theoretical framework, I would say that he argues that technology is a way of revealing or revelation that, well, it is not produced, it is not known as new knowledge produced from tabula rasa conditions, but it is a somehow description of the existing properties of materials and existing conditions of affairs. And I think that would be somehow similar to the description of the Worldgeist coming into the consciousness of itself, or the revelation would be somehow equivalent or compared to the process of coming to the consciousness of its own being, its own being there, its own like Dasein. So yeah, that may be my response to it.
One very quick last comment.
Okay. Quick question, if I may, for Daphne, because she hasn't had a chance to speak yet. So just if you could identify, I'm going to invite you to I guess, find the weakest part of your essay and the strongest in your view.
No, I think there are many weak parts, especially the third part, where I think the plates where they become oniric tales, and I think if I have the opportunity to write more about the essay, I would widen the scope by making a comparison between one of the plates and a tale. And I would also like to tell you a really quick anecdote. So when I was very small, my grandma used to have this huge collection of encyclopedias. And during summer, she chose one of the plates. And instead of, so this is kind of tragic, I think, and funny as well, she used to come and narrate one of these plates. So instead of listening to Grimm's tales, I was listening to my grandma's plates. And I think this is something that could be written more in depth, because it's really important to state that these are poetic instruments. And the first part of the question, the strong part of the essay. Maybe I think that the way I analyzed the plate is by taking into consideration how Diderot and D'Alembert structured their line of thought with the grid. And I used the grid to understand how, if the plate was transmitting knowledge. And I think this also connects to your question. And it was very important for me to understand what they did in order to be able to criticize their tool, their knowledge tool.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. We are very shortly going to ask everybody who's not a juror to leave the room. And we're going to close the online part of this so we can have a private conversation. But if we could just do a round of applause for our wonderful third years.